Hi, I'm Camilla Vasquez, and I'm a professor of applied linguistics at the University of South Florida. In my teaching and research, I focus on how the language that we use shapes our social reality. Over the last 15 years, I've studied language use in a lot of different contexts, mostly focusing on computer-mediated communication. Today, ABC, the Association for Business Communication, has invited me to present a virtual lecture as a response to the current situation that many faculty and students are facing right now, as we find ourselves suddenly having to transition to 100% learning and teaching online. So my talk today is about the role of language in leadership and crisis communication. And we're going to be taking a detailed look at the language of some of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's press briefings. As we all know, we're in the middle of a global health crisis of unprecedented magnitude. Everyone's trying to make sense of this new situation using their own perspectives and filters. And I happen to be a linguist, so I've been thinking about all the different kinds of ways that this crisis is affecting our language, our communication, and our interactions with others. At the most obvious level, we can think about words and expressions. So up until a few months ago, none of us had even knew what COVID or coronavirus was. These days, we're also hearing about and talking about many new policies and practices like social distancing, lockdown, sheltering at home or sheltering in place, self-quarantine, and flattening the curve. These expressions have become completely mainstream almost overnight, whereas, just a few weeks ago, these were not part of our everyday vocabulary. And it's not only what we're communicating, but how we're communicating and staying connected that's changed quite a bit recently. With many of us not just working from home, but also socializing from home, we're probably spending a lot more time on platforms like Zoom, Skype, and WhatsApp than we normally would. And we're using these platforms kind of throughout our day to stay connected with colleagues, classmates, family, and friends. Some of these changes maybe have added a little bit to our stress level, like when we're trying to get something done, but the internet connection keeps getting interrupted, or when our child, our spouse, or one of our pets suddenly decides that they need our attention at the most inopportune time. And on another level, we're also probably feeling a little bit stressed out right now, wondering if we or our loved ones maybe are at risk of getting the virus. And at the same time, we're trying to just do our very best to stay safe and healthy and to protect others as well. So one of the ways that we as humans deal with stress, uncertainty, frustration, and these kinds of feelings is through humor and playfulness. And if you're like me, you're getting sent an average of, maybe 3 or 4 of these kinds of cute kitties working hard in the home office via the computer. And I'm not embarrassed to admit it. They never fail to bring a smile to my face. I'm also really interested in COVID memes and other forms of humorous content that people are sharing and circulating online these days. So here in the state of Florida where I live, we're used to being the butt of jokes, and COVID memes are no exception. So Florida was not among the first states to respond to the crisis with social distancing recommendations. So fair enough, we've been the target of some COVID-related humor, like this image that depicts the coronavirus as a bottle of Corona beer heading toward the state of Florida on a hurricane map. Of course, here in Florida, we're pretty used to seeing natural disasters coming our way in the form of a hurricane map. So humor helps us deal with stress. It's kind of like a cathartic mechanism, and sharing funny text definitely helps us feel connected to others during this difficult time. It's really a way of emphasizing our groupness and kind of like saying, hey, we're all going through this really weird experience these days together. We're all feeling the same kinds of things. But of course, not everything is funny these days. And we can't lose sight of the fact that this is a global pandemic and lots of people are getting very, very sick and worse. So we're also paying attention to much more serious forms of mediated communication. We're watching the news to learn about the latest developments and keep ourselves updated. And we're also looking to our political leaders for both information and guidance. For those of you who have been following the recent news in the United States, you're probably aware that New York Governor Andrew Cuomo is being widely praised in the mass media for standing out as a great leader in this time of uncertainty and adversity. And you may have seen that Cuomo has been appearing in all kinds of news headlines in both the national and international news outlets. Not surprisingly, he's been also getting a lot of attention on social media. So hashtag Cuomo for president is currently trending on Twitter. And that appears with positive assessments about his leadership, usually as a response to the crisis in his state. And then as a side note, other Cuomo-related hashtags are also turning up. So hashtags like Cuomo Brothers, for people who enjoy the playful teasing and verbal banter that take place between the governor and his brother, CNN reporter Chris Cuomo. We occasionally see this on television. Other playful hashtags are appearing, like Cuomo Crush and Cuomo Sexual, the latter of which seems to have entered our lexicon thanks to some late night television hosts. And it's not just on Twitter. Positive comments praising Cuomo's leadership can also be found on other social media platforms like YouTube. And I should take a moment just to clarify what we mean by leadership is not just Cuomo's actions, because if we're not residents of the state of New York, we may not really even know that much about his actions. But something that all of us can observe with respect to Cuomo's leadership is his talk. And we can see that expressed so beautifully here in this final YouTube comment where the user posts, "This person, when he talks, calms me down. Thank you for speaking clearly and to the point. This is the kind of leadership that the USA needs." We might stop ourselves to ask at this point, what exactly is leadership? Well, for many decades, we used to think that a leader had certain personality traits or characteristics. But the limitation of this approach was that we treated the traits and behaviors of leaders kind of like they were fixed objects, operating basically independently of context and environmental factors. Like, let's face it, it's not that hard to be a great leader when things are going pretty well and when there are no huge problems or issues that need to be solved. So because of this limitation of kind of this older way of understanding leadership, leadership has come to be replaced more recently by a social constructivist perspective, which maintains that leadership is discursive. What I mean by that is just the idea that it's only through language and communication that leadership comes into existence. So according to many scholars today, leadership is not just a fixed trait or a quality that belongs only to a few individuals. Instead, leadership is established by observable practices of speaking and interacting. In other words, individuals become leaders by the specific language they use, one interaction at a time, and by how they respond to others in different situations. Now, as we all know, effective leadership is especially important during times of crisis. But what exactly constitutes a crisis? Well, according to one often cited definition, a troubling event becomes a crisis when, number one, it comes as a surprise. We had no warning that it was coming. Number two, when it poses some kind of a serious threat, like many people are at risk of dying. And number three, when it requires a short response time, like we don't have the luxury to think through all different kinds of scenarios and possible outcomes. We need to act rapidly and immediately. My colleagues in communication studies who take a social constructivist perspective argue that it's not just the response to a crisis that's constructed through communication, but it's also the very crisis itself and how it's understood that's constituted through language and communication. Obviously, responding to and managing a crisis requires different types of communication, and being good at engaging in crisis communication is therefore really a fundamental element of effective leadership. So with these ideas in mind, and with so many journalists and lay people alike describing and praising Governor Cuomo as an effective leader, my question today is this: what can we learn about effective leadership in the face of crisis by studying Andrew Cuomo's public press briefings about the COVID situation? In order to find out, I compiled 20 transcripts of Cuomo's daily press briefings from a 3-week period in March. So I started at the kind of in the first few weeks of March when the virus was just surfacing and we were only finding out about it through the end of the month. These data represent about 20 hours of talk, give or take a few, and over 120,000 words. Now, I don't have time today to talk about everything that I've discovered, but I'm going to focus instead on just a few key findings related to patterns of language and communication. And I'll be highlighting specific examples from only one of these briefings, the one from Saturday, March 21st, which I just kind of chose randomly. I'll be sharing a few clips from Cuomo's speech, and then I'll be highlighting specific features of language that I'm focusing on. And if you want to access the entire briefing after my lecture's over, it's available on YouTube at the link that you see here. To give you a preview, what I'm arguing today is that Cuomo's doing at least 7 things with language on a pretty regular basis in his press briefings. And these 7 things together, along with, I'm sure, numerous other factors, are enacting effective leadership. These 7 factors also turn up in most, if not all, of his speeches. So number 1, he recognizes and thanks other people. He gives credit to a lot of other people, and he recognizes that it takes a strong team to get things done. Number 2, he describes decisive actions that he and his team are taking. He frames these actions as a collective, collaborative effort. Yet at the same time, he also takes personal responsibility and shows that he's out there in the trenches himself. He's not just kind of removed and detached, overseeing the efforts of others. Number 4, he humanizes this experience as something that he and his family are going through, and this makes him relatable. He's experiencing all of the exact same things, all the feelings, all the challenges, all the questions, all the frustrations that all of us are going through right now. Number 5, and this is perhaps the most important one, he prioritizes facts, data, and numbers as underpinning his decision-making and his policies. But at the same time, he also addresses emotions, and he recognizes that what people are feeling right now is very real and very important. And finally, he also acts like he doesn't act like he knows everything. So he's willing to say when he doesn't know something. We also see him frequently deferring to experts on certain topics, and he acknowledges the uncertainty and the changing nature of the situation. Okay, so in this first short clip, we're going to see that Cuomo starts off this press briefing on March 21st, just like he does many of his other ones, by introducing the key members of his team who are joining him.
You know the people who are here today from my far right. Simonita Sobotic, who is in charge of managing supplies, which is a major function for us. Robert Mujica, the Director Division of the Budget. Melissa DeRosa, Secretary to the Governor. Great James Malatras, who's been of tremendous help here.
As you just saw, he not only introduces each team member by name, but he also describes or acknowledges the specific contributions that they're making or the functions that they serve. In addition to that, Cuomo thanks a lot of people every time he speaks. And you can see an example in this next clip where he thanks Dr. Anthony Fauci for his guidance in helping come up with public health recommendations for senior citizens and for people with compromised immune systems.
I want to thank Dr. Fauci, who is really an extraordinary American and has given me great guidance and help and assistance in putting together these policies. So I'd like to thank him.
In fact, in looking at all of the texts I've collected, I found that thanking shows up an average of 4 times per briefing. Cuomo thanks everyone from medical doctors, other healthcare workers, hospital staff, emergency personnel. He thanks bus drivers. He thanks the Army Corps of Engineers, the National Guard, governors of many other states, the mayor of New York City. He thanks the U.S. president and vice president, and owners of businesses that are helping out, to name just a few. Now, recognizing and thanking so many different groups and individuals is a way of showing that it takes a massive, coordinated effort to address this public health emergency with everybody working together and doing their part. Another way that Cuomo constructs effective leadership is that he describes decisive and collective actions that he and his team are taking. So this is one of the segments from the first 3 minutes of his briefing. And you'll see his language here emphasizes both the competence as well as the experience of his team. And it leaves no doubt that he and his team are doing all that they possibly can right now.
Working on every level, every piston is firing, everything that can be done is being done. New Yorkers are lucky. We have a very experienced team that's doing this. This is not their first rodeo. They've been through a number.
I'd like to emphasize just a few things about his language choices here. So he's using some metaphorical language to communicate his message, like every piston is firing and not their first rodeo. This is powerful figurative language, language that helps us make associations with mental images. He also, as we see here, uses repetition often to reinforce his point. So in this case, every piston, every level, everything. And you may have also noticed the repetition of the plural pronoun we that helps give us this idea of coordinated or collaborative team effort. In fact, we is the most frequent pronoun that Cuomo uses in his briefings. He uses it about 1.5 times as often as he uses the singular pronoun I. And if you pay attention as you watch this next clip, you'll notice that we is the grammatical subject of every single sentence.
Levels, increasing hospital capacity. We want to get the capacity of 50,000 up to a minimum of 75,000. We told the hospitals we're going to be ending elective surgeries. We are now working with hospitals to reconfigure the space in the hospital to get more beds and to find more staff to manage those beds. We're working on building new beds. We're going to go out and review a number of sites today.
So the pattern that we see here is the frequent use of plural pronoun we, and that's followed by an active verb of some sort, either in the past, the ongoing present, or the future tense. So verbs like we told, we're ending, we're working on, we're going, and so on. These are the specific details of language that are being used within a larger rhetorical strategy, which is that Cuomo starts by introducing an overarching main point. He follows that by a specific goal, and then he details a series of what concrete steps are being taken to achieve that goal. And you may have also noticed that as he's speaking, this is also reflected multimodally, so in the hierarchical organization of the text on the slides that appear just to the right of him. At the same time, though, Cuomo makes it absolutely clear that he is very much a part of this collective we, and we'll see that in this next clip.
A number of sites today. I'd like to get a final list to the federal government and the Army Corps of Engineers today. But we're looking at Javits, SUNY Stony Brook, SUNY Westbury, the Westchester Convention Center, and I'm going to go out and take a look at those sites today. Or the ones I can get to. That would give us a regional distribution and a real capacity if we can get them up quickly enough. And then increasing supplies, which is...
So even though the bulk of Cuomo's talk frames actions taken as a coordinated collaborative effort, other times he also shows that he's out there in the trenches himself, like we see here. In other words, he's not just delegating and overseeing the efforts of others, acting like a manager who's detached or removed from the situation, but he's literally there on the ground getting the work done himself. Another characteristic of all of Cuomo's speeches is that he really emphasizes facts, data, and numbers. The word number or numbers actually turns up an average of 25 times per briefing as he reports on how the situation is changing from day to day. And what you're looking at here is some linguistic software output of just a few of the 500 references to numbers in 20 of Cuomo's press briefings. If you were to take a closer look and really dig in there a little bit, you'd see that these numerical references include statistics on everything from how many people affected by the virus are currently hospitalized in the state of New York to what we know currently about COVID survival rates in other countries. And Cuomo is just incredibly skilled at explaining these complex statistical concepts in a way that's very clear and very accessible. In one of his later briefings, Cuomo states, "I don't operate on opinion, I operate on facts, on data, on numbers, and on projections that we have." And he's really adamant about separating facts from opinions. Part of the challenge of managing uncertainty during a crisis like this is being able to clearly tease out the facts and separate them from just opinions or rumors. As he explains in this next clip, where he points out that young people in New York are not complying with the social distancing restrictions that are in place.
We do have an issue with younger people who are not complying. And I mentioned this before, but it has not gotten better. You know, you can have your own opinion. You cannot have your own facts, okay? You want to have an opinion? Have an opinion. But you can't have your own facts. Well, young people don't get this disease. You are wrong. That is not a fact. 18 to 49 years old are 54% of the cases in New York State. 54%. 18 to 49 years old.
And even though Cuomo emphasizes how much he relies on facts, data, and numbers in his decision-making, at the same time he recognizes and even talks at length about how very important our feelings and emotions are. And we'll see that in this clip.
Consequences, but we also need to talk about the social consequences. And it's hard to gauge and it's hard to measure because there is no Dow Jones index that we can watch on the screen that is measuring the social consequences and the social decline. But the stress, the anxiety, the emotions that are provoked by this crisis are truly significant. And people are struggling with the emotions as much as they are struggling with the economics.
Feelings and emotions are some of the things that we all share as humans, and many people are feeling anxious, uncertain, stressed out, frustrated, panicky at this time. There's one other thing that I'd like to point out in this excerpt, and that's one of the things I think that makes Cuomo such an effective leader in a time of great uncertainty, and that is that he doesn't claim to know everything or have all the answers. He's clear in articulating the limits of his certainty and delineating what is known from what is not known and what cannot be known. He's also very candid in saying that facts can change, and they do change from one day to the next. And that's probably one of the main reasons for having these daily press briefings in the first place, to sort of account for the shifting and changing nature of what is known. And finally, if you've watched several of these briefings, then you know Cuomo pretty well, and you know that he makes personal references to a number of his family members, his mother, his siblings, and his daughters. And he talks about how all of them, himself included, are being personally affected by this crisis. And so this positions Cuomo as no different from the rest of us and what all of us are going through. It really helps humanize the situation that he's talking about. So he's not just reporting kind of sterile facts about numbers of hospital beds or numbers of ventilators, but he's sharing some of these personal anecdotes about what his family's going through. Whether he is advising young people not to travel for spring break, as he did in one press briefing, or in this next case, he's showing us the family decision-making process, like as they discuss what they should do to keep an aging parent as safe as possible. And many of us may be able to relate to this as well.
Matilda's Law, which is for the vulnerable population, senior citizens, people with compromised immune systems, underlying illnesses, that was very specific. As I mentioned, named it for my mother Matilda because I went through this with my own siblings. How do we help mom? Where do we bring mom? There was a difference of opinion. The best health professionals put together guidelines that can not only help senior citizens but also their families who are trying to deal with this. I know it was helpful to my family. And the question among siblings, these laws and guidelines answered. I don't want to mention which sibling, but turns out that he was wrong.
On a rhetorical level, it's quite interesting to see how Cuomo mobilizes his own relational identities at different points in his speeches. So here he's clearly positioning himself as a devoted son who's showing concern for his mother. And he's trying to make the best decision to keep her safe, which we learn is actually a topic of discussion among his siblings. And if you caught it at the very end, you see Cuomo also positioning himself as a brother when he makes a reference to a little bit of sibling rivalry, maybe. Although he doesn't name him, we can be pretty sure that he's indirectly pointing out that his younger brother, Chris Cuomo, was wrong in this case. And as I mentioned earlier, the two Cuomo brothers are known for their humorous back and forth banter that they engage in on television from time to time. In fact, in another briefing that happened 10 days after this one, so the briefing from March 31st, the governor broke the news about Chris Cuomo testing positive for the COVID virus, which Governor Cuomo then followed with a 7-minute narrative about how at an earlier point in the outbreak, Chris wanted to move their mother to his house, but that he, Governor Cuomo, insisted she would be much safer if she stayed in her own home. And it was at this point, after being advised by the medical community, that he named this precaution Matilda's Law after his own mother. So as I begin to wrap up my talk, I'd like to briefly summarize the main language patterns that we've seen illustrated by Governor Cuomo in his press briefings. We've noted things like how he recognizes and thanks other people, the way that he describes decisive collective actions being taken by him and his team and many, many other social actors. This is a coordinated effort. Everybody needs to participate. Yet at the same time, we also see how he takes personal responsibility, and he does act individually as well. I think in one of his talks, he said, if you're going to blame somebody, blame me. I'm the one who's making these decisions. Number 4, he humanizes the crisis situation by telling us quite a bit of detail about how his own family members are coping and how they're reacting. As we saw, he really highlights and emphasizes the importance of facts, data, and numbers in his decision making. Yet at the same time, he also addresses the importance of attending to and responding to the very real emotional aspects of this crisis. And finally, he acknowledges uncertainty, and he's very clear about what he does know and what he does not know. Now, of course, these 7 patterns have probably just barely scratched the surface, and there's obviously a lot of other things that could be said about Cuomo's style of communication. For instance, we could talk about the fact that he uses fairly simple, straightforward, and uncomplicated syntax. We could also pay attention to his overall rate of speech. It seems to me like he speaks pretty slowly. And we might also want to take a look at his use of pausing. So it seems like after each important point that he makes, he pauses briefly so that viewers can really soak in the meaning and the impact of his words. And as you've been watching and listening today, you may have even picked up on some other features of his talk that might be interesting to explore further. So in the last 20 minutes or so, I've been talking about some of the language patterns that I've identified that are associated with effective leadership in a time of crisis. But at this point, I'd like you to think carefully about some of the texts that you are interacting with these days, the texts that are shaping your understanding of this new global situation that we're living through, whether it's communication from your university's leadership or from your employer or from owners of businesses that you regularly interact with. What does their messaging consist of? What kinds of communication are most important these days? And what kinds of language is being used to achieve these goals? If you think about it, actually, many of the forms of communication that we're engaging in these days can be thought of some form of crisis communication. I thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me today. And if you have any questions or comments about my talk, I'd invite you to reach out to me. As you can see, my email is here on the last slide. Finally, I'd like to wish all of you good health, peace, and productivity. Thank you.